Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today we'll be concluding our look at the second quarter of 1968. That is the months of April, May, and June. We'll be talking about what the Beach Boys were up to, this being a very eventful, if not particularly happy quarter for them. But first, let's talk about what was going on at the movies in that second quarter of 1968. Considering the interest in the space program and technology, there had been surprisingly few science fiction movies in the 60s. There were, of course, some very low-budget titles and a few better movies, such as George Pal's version of The Time Machine with Rod Taylor at the beginning of the decade in 1960, the very good but unfortunately titled Robinson Crusoe on Mars in 1964, and Fantastic Voyage in 1966. But really, there had been very few science fiction films in an era that seems like it should have been full of them. That changed a bit early in April when two new science fiction movies went into wide release. The first of those on April 2nd was Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. With its unusual soundtrack, structure, and plot, it at first confused and alienated a lot of viewers and critics. In an era where filmmakers were always clear to spell out every single plot point, this movie left it up to the viewer and didn't care if you were confused. It appeared it was going to be a box office bomb. After a slow start, audiences began to grow and people debated what it all meant. It also got a reputation among heads as a great movie to watch in an altered state. It went to number 1 at the box office on June 19th. Opening in wide release the next day, April 3rd, was Planet of the Apes. Pierre Boulle's 1963 satirical novel had been turned into a cleverly written, fast-paced science fiction adventure starring Charlton Heston. Everybody now remembers the big twist at the end, but it was a film that immediately put audiences off balance by introducing the cliched presumed love interest, an attractive female astronaut, in the pre-title sequence, only to kill her off in the next scene without her ever uttering a single line. After that, twists and surprises came thick and fast, culminating with that famous final scene. Even as an 8-year-old, I recognized the major logical flaw of the movie is that the apes speak English. Apparently, the filmmakers considered coming up with an ape language that Heston's character would have to learn, but decided it would just slow down the pace of the film too much and went with the conceit of everybody just speaking English. On repeated viewings, I'm impressed that the writers even included a line about cloud cover and a strange luminosity at night to explain why 3 astronauts just couldn't look up in the night sky, see the moon and the constellations, and realize what planet they were actually on. Though it was lost on me as a kid, they even managed to retain some of the satire of Boole's novel. They seem to have thought of everything. If you had attended a first-run showing of the movie, you might have picked up a copy of this promo newspaper, The Ape, in the lobby. Let's take a quick look at what was in the headlines in that spring 1968 edition of The Ape. The top headline tells us the latest hunt was a great success with a big roundup of human beasts. In opinion, man is a danger to ape civilization. Must be exterminated, says scientist. On page 2, we find out, unsurprisingly, that scientist is none other than Dr. Zaius. Doctors Zira and Cornelius have been accused of heresy. An intelligent human claim has been dismissed as nonsense. On the back page, we learn a man has been recaptured after a daring escape and that 8 guards were overpowered by the crazed human animal. And in a little note at the bottom, market rise. The wholesale price of bananas at the Simeon market rose by an unprecedented 17% today. There was a rush of panic buying in anticipation of further rises. And that's the news from Ape City. During the spring and summer of '68, you might have collected a series of 44 Planet of the Apes bubblegum cards, which I'll try to show just briefly. Try to keep the glare off these. I'm not sure how well you can make them out. Each one had a little paragraph on the back explaining a scene from the movie. And kind of surprisingly, they did reveal the big twist ending, which I would have thought they would have kept secret on the cards. But there you have it. So there you have the Planet of the Apes. A week later, another movie opened starring Charlton Heston, Will Penny, a Western. Released on April 24th, Yours, Mine, and Ours, starring Henry Fonda as a single father of 10 children and Lucille Ball as a single mother of 8 children, and the wacky adventures when they start a romance and the blending of their families when the two marry. Though the pilot for the Brady Bunch was already written before this, The movie's success may have prompted ABC to approve it as a series in the fall of 1969. On May 2nd, we got The Odd Couple, written by Neil Simon, starring Walter Matthau as Oscar Madison and Jack Lemmon as Felix Unger. At the end of May, we got AIP's Wild in the Streets, about a rock musician and aspiring revolutionary, Max Frost, leading teenagers to take over the U.S. government and the havoc that ensues, showing just how far AIP's teen fare had changed from the Beach Party movies of just a few years earlier. On June 1st, another Western, Bandolero, starring James Stewart, Dean Martin, and Raquel Welch. On June 12th came Rosemary's Baby, directed by Roman Polanski and starring Mia Farrow. It would be #1 from August 14th through September 4th, and again for the week of September 18th. Also released that day was Speedway, another Elvis Presley movie, this time with Nancy Sinatra. This one had actually been filmed before Stay Away Joe, which was released in March. On June 19th came The Green Berets, John Wayne's embarrassingly over-the-top war epic, and The Thomas Crown Affair, which would win the Oscar for Best Original Song with Windmills of Your Mind. Meanwhile, a young commercial artist from New York had captured the mod spirit of the late 60s and was rapidly becoming a star. His name was Peter Max. He'd cemented his place with the counterculture by designing the flyers for the second Human Bee Inn in New York's Central Park, held on March 26, 1967, after the Easter Parade. Ostensibly a peaceful protest against the war and against racism, it was a gathering of counterculture types and curious folks who wandered over to the park after the parade, and was estimated to have been attended by over 10,000 people. Peter Max posters became hot items at head shops, and he was also embraced by the mainstream media. On Thursday, August 15, 1968, he was a guest on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, where the set was decorated with his work. Also in 1968, he appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, doing drawings live on stage. The September 6, 1969 issue of Life magazine ran a cover story on him with a feature article entitled Portrait of the Artist as a Very Rich Young Man. He lent his designs to a lot of commercial endeavors in the late 60s and early 70s. Eventually, Max designs were used on 72 product lines, including clothing, furniture, clocks, and cookware. Max was far from the only artist working in this basic style. There was, for example, Heinz Edelman, who in the spring of '68 was busily collaborating on an upcoming feature film based on the song Yellow Submarine and starring cartoon images of the Beatles. Peter Max did become the best known of these artists through the quality and quantity of his work, relentless promotion, and inventive commercial applications. Rarely has any artist so perfectly captured the zeitgeist of an era as Peter Max did in 1968. Now turning to the Beach Boys. Apart from Dennis's Little Bird, which had been recorded on February 29th, recording of the Friends album got underway in earnest on March 18th when Mike returned from Rishikesh. The album was completed on April 4th, just before the band left for a tour of the Southeast. They had toured with Buffalo Springfield and the Strawberry Alarm Clock in November of 1967, and they would be joining them again for this tour. The first show was scheduled for April 5th in Nashville, Tennessee. All three bands were already in Nashville when they got the news that Martin Luther King had been assassinated in Memphis and the show was canceled. All three bands spent a sad, dreary, depressing day hanging out at the Holiday Inn. Fears of violence in the wake of the assassination continued to plague the tour. The next day they moved on to Greenville, North Carolina for 2 shows. The afternoon show was played as scheduled. The evening show was rescheduled for April 23rd. The next day they moved on to Greensboro, South Carolina for 2 shows. Again, the afternoon show was played, the evening show was canceled. An April 8th show in Charleston, South Carolina was canceled. The tour began to get back on track a little bit on April 9th, with 3 shows successfully played in Florida. A show was also played in Florida on April 10th. Shows in Macon, Georgia, and in Atlanta, Georgia were canceled due to rioting. It was a grueling tour. With many dates rescheduled, it kept them on the road through April 24th. Between canceled shows, rescheduled shows, and low attendance due to fear of violence keeping people at home, manager Nick Grillo estimated that it cost the Beach Boys at least $350,000 in lost revenue. On April 15th, the Friends single was released. It would peak at only number 47 for 2 weeks beginning May 18th. In the UK, it would go to number 25. Just 9 days after completing their disastrously timed tour of the Southeast, the Beach Boys headed back out on the road again with the Maharishi, for a tour that they hoped would put them back on track. 3 weeks earlier, on April 12th, John Lennon and George Harrison had abruptly left the Maharishi's ashram in Rishikesh, India, and returned to London. The Beatles publicly distanced themselves from the Maharishi and moved on to launching their new business, Apple, and working on their new album. An interesting bit of Beatle trivia I had never heard before comes from the two-part story on the Maharishi in the Saturday Evening Post that we talked about in the last episode. It featured first-hand reporting from the Beatles' time in Rishikesh by Louis H. Lapham. In it, Lapham mentions that George Harrison had surprised everyone by saying he assumed the Beatles all had the same mantra. The mantras, which had been given to them by the Maharishi, were supposed to remain personal and not be shared. But, George says, he heard his mantra used by John in I Am the Walrus, making him think that he and John must have the same mantra, and he presumed that mantra had been given to Paul and Ringo as well. So somewhere in I Am the Walrus is George's mantra, presumably because it was also John's mantra, and possibly the mantra of all four Beatles. Getting back to the Beach Boys, their tour was supposed to combine a Beach Boys concert with a lecture on transcendental meditation by the Maharishi. And I can only imagine that a Venn diagram of audience members interested in both halves of that show would have been pretty narrow. Anyway, by this time, the Maharishi was old news to those who would have been curious a few months earlier. Worse still, with the Beatles now distancing themselves from the Maharishi and the Beach Boys continuing to promote him, it looked to some like a misguided attempt by the group to jump on a hip bandwagon that they didn't realize was already uncool. People stayed away in droves. As one promoter remarked, the Maharishi couldn't draw flies. Ticket sales at most venues were abysmal. Apparently, and maybe not surprisingly, the Maharishi also wasn't the kind of reliable showbiz professional that the Beach Boys were used to working with. Everybody seems to agree he was a very nice guy, but he missed an important press conference with the band in New York on May 2nd, having missed his connecting flight between Istanbul and New York because he was busy meditating. Also, apparently, he was involved in the production of a documentary about himself in transcendental meditation at the time, which seemed to take priority over his commitments to tour with the Beach Boys. The Maharishi tour played 5 of the 7 scheduled dates between May 3rd and May 5th. Dates after May 5th were canceled. Apparently, the Maharishi initially agreed to return for shows in Denver and in California later in May, but these too were soon canceled. In the end, 24 shows were canceled at a rumored cost of $250,000. With the tour officially canceled, the group returned to LA. It was around this time that Dennis Wilson happened to pick up a couple of female hippie hitchhikers on a couple of occasions. Badman's book puts the chance meetings in early April. Other sources put it in May. The Beach Boys in Concert book has the group playing a show in Greenville, North Carolina on one of those April dates, so I'm guessing that the May timeframe is probably correct. Anyway, in short order, the hitchhikers had moved themselves into Dennis's rented house on Sunset Boulevard, along with their entire commune and the commune's leader, an aspiring musician named Charlie Manson. It was a situation that Dennis, at least initially, seemed to enjoy. Also in late May, the band began recording a new song called Rendezvous. It was soon retitled Do It Again. And on June 24th, the Beach Boys' Friends album was released. We will talk about this beginning in the next episode. Hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into 1968. And by the way, I think I'm going to make the next 2 quarters also 2-parters. I could, rush through it and leave some things out. But as Seals and Crofts said, we may never pass this way again, at least not for a long time. So if there's fun things and interesting things to talk about in 68, I'd like to take a little more time and do it. So I hope that's okay. Please let me know if this is just getting to be too much 1968, and I'll take that under advisement. If not, please like and subscribe, or please like and subscribe anyway. I love to hear your comments. I look forward to talking about the Friends album. We will see you next week to start doing just that. Thanks. Bye.